Hey everybody, welcome back. What I want to do tonight, since our schedule got messed up by the pretest you took today, and just so you know, there are times when school gets in the way of your education, unfortunately, and that's what happened today. So just bear with me, and I think that by us flipping this, we'll still be able to get what you need and what we would have been able to kind of hash out a little bit in class today. Like I'd said the night before, we were going to do an activity in class, and I think that we'll probably still do that on Monday. But I do want to give you a bit of a review on Chapter 1 of the Janda reading, and then some other elements that hopefully will help what you read make a little bit more sense. And so let's just hit on a few high points, and hopefully this will lead you into tonight's reading coming from the wall. It's reading number 1, Locke's second treatise of government. So you started off last night reading Janda, and he and the other authors wanted to make sure that they established what the purposes of government really were. And so you've got 3 main purposes. You've got to protect, which is maintaining order. You've got to provide, and there's a lot of variation on what that actually means by government. What is it that the government absolutely must provide, and then what are some things that people disagree on. Then the third thing would be to promote equality. And government's balance or range hit different points on the scale as to where they fall on that continuum. Then you read about Hobbes and his Leviathan and this thing called the social contract. And this social contract is a term that's going to come up many times throughout this year. There are many writers that spoke on the same topic, and these writers influenced the fathers or the founders of our country, the founding fathers, especially through Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. But generally, or essentially, with the social contract, the idea is that you have to surrender some freedoms so that the government can provide those services. So you've got government control versus personal freedoms, and most people are they're willing to give up some freedom for government benefits. And that's why I wanted you to read the article Freedom versus Security, because I want you to consider some of these difficulties. It really is like walking a tightrope, and that's one of the things that was mentioned in the reading. So I like to talk about this during class. Is the government listening to our conversations, or is the government having a thumb on our every activity? Is that just a part of being chained, like James Madison had said? Or is that too extreme? Is this a necessary evil in order to be able to enjoy the services and protection that our government gives us? Where is the line between freedom and security, or freedom and order? So Hobbes writes about this exchange in Leviathan. He says that life in the natural state, in the state of nature, it's nasty, it's brutish, it's short, and so we have to have a king or a ruler to help keep things in order. So essentially, government should make us safe. That's the big idea in the Leviathan. Well, tonight you're going to read about John Locke. And with John Locke, he takes Hobbes' idea of this state of nature. But what Locke says, and Locke was also an Englishman, John Locke, not the guy from Lost, different guy, but there actually are a lot of themes and characters that tie in if you've ever watched the Lost series. There was also another character called Rousseau, and there's another philosopher during this time period that was named Jean-Jacques Rousseau that we'll talk about. And so it's a pretty neat way to tie in their philosophies into a television series. Anyway, we can talk about that in class too. John Locke, the philosopher, took Hobbes' state of nature idea, and he said that there is an absence of government, but we do have natural rights. These are things that we're born with. That should sound really familiar, like inalienable rights maybe. And these natural rights would include life, liberty, and property. You thought I was going to say the pursuit of happiness, didn't you? Anyway, Locke went with property. And he says these things in his book, the second treatise on government. Treatise is a short book, basically. And this was, like I said, this was a document that really inspired Thomas Jefferson and the other framers. So the state of nature, according to Locke, does have some rules. You don't kill, you don't steal, you use your stuff well, you respect other people's life, liberty, property, etc. But it's up to the individual to interpret that law. And so it's also up to the individual to figure out a way to enforce that state of nature law, these natural rights. And so this could lead into some serious problems as far as differing interpretations, and also the ability to back up yourself. And so that could lead to violence, it could lead to insecurity. And so what Locke said has to happen is people have to form a social compact or contract or an agreement. People join together to protect their lives. They protect their liberty and they protect their property. They don't have to give up their liberties when they join this compact, but they do have to give up the ability to interpret a law on their own. They kind of come to an agreement. There's an agreed set of rules that all the people have to live by. And so they also have to agree to enforce it. The other thing that Locke came up with was this idea that there needs to be a separate judicial power, or a power that makes decisions on whether or not someone has done something right or wrong. There needs to be a separate executive power, so this would be the power that enforces whatever laws exist. And then there needs to be a separate legislative power, and this is the power that actually makes the laws that the group follows. And there should be some checks and balances between each power. These are all things that you've heard of before, but Locke was the guy that really came up with it. So the legislative branch of our government, essentially, comes from this idea of the social compact that Locke came up with. Locke went a step further than Hobbes, though, also. So Hobbes is saying that the government will protect the people, and the people will follow the government. What Locke continued on with that idea was saying that if the government does not protect the people, if the government fails on their end of the agreement, if the government breaks the social contract, then, if you've heard this phrase, if the government is consistently failing the wishes of the people, if there's a long train of grievances, if you've ever heard that from the Declaration of Independence, then the social contract is broken, and the people don't have to follow the government anymore. I mean, this is big stuff. This was Locke basically saying that there is a clause for rebellion in this understanding of how government should work. So the people, as long as they're the majority, they have the right to destroy the government, and the government has the right to suppress the revolution as long as the majority will of the people actually want that to happen. So if there's a small group of people that's trying to overthrow the government, if the majority says no, then the government still has the sovereignty to suppress it. So Locke's goal is peace. He's not just constantly calling for rebellion, but it's a peace that constantly has the possibility of war. So it's basically like a warning to the rulers. You guys have got to scratch our back and take care of us, or we're going to overthrow you. So the government exists for the people, not the people for the government. This is a revolutionary idea that was unheard of at the time, and it actually got Locke into a lot of trouble. Okay, now, so that's kind of a precursor to what you're going to read tonight about John Locke. Let's hop back on the Janda chapter and talk about some more themes there. At the beginning of the chapter, Janda does talk about government as being our provider, and as I said a few minutes ago, that does create some problems because we don't know exactly, or there is disagreement, I should say, along the line of what should or what must the government absolutely provide for us. The government's decisions have to be a trade-off in values between order, freedom, and equality. And there's two types of freedom. There's a freedom of, and there's a freedom from. And the way that I usually describe this is that if you were to go to a restaurant and you are a vegetarian, and the person at the seat behind you orders a steak, you have freedom of choice. You have the choice to eat meat or not eat meat. But it's not freedom from meat. So it would be absurd for you to stand up and slap the steak out of the guy's hand behind you and say, "This offends me. I have freedom from this experience or this choice of yours." So freedom of is the freedom to choose the things you want to without constraint. Freedom from would be something in a different category. Now, freedom from can also mean freedom from oppression or freedom from exploitation. But if the guy behind you is eating a steak, he's not oppressing you. He's also experiencing his freedom of. We got 4 different types of freedoms, and the Norman Rockwell pictures in your chapter exemplify that really well. So you have freedom of speech, you have freedom from fear, you have freedom of worship, and then freedom from want were the 4 picks that you saw. The First Amendment of the Constitution phrases that differently. So this is not the First Amendment to the Constitution. We'll talk about that First Amendment, but there is a great deal of overlap. The concept of order. So we've talked about freedom. Now order, that could be just basically the preservation of life. That could be protecting your property. It could be serving the social order. And the social order generally is just the accepted way of doing things. So our government could step in to preserve what the status quo is. And there was a really interesting graphic in the book that showed nations who valued maintaining order versus nations who value maintaining freedom of speech, and finding the United States on both of those graphics. It was good that we were on both graphics, but there's a big difference between the order, us maintaining order as being important, and then us maintaining freedom of speech. So just check that out. I thought that was kind of interesting. Now the concept of equality, the third in the big three. By basic definition, political equality is one person, one vote. We can expand that definition to social equality, and so we have equality in wealth and education and status, and that's where it gets really hairy. Is it the government's responsibility to make sure that we're socially equal? And if so, to what extent? So equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome becomes the real conflict. My question I want you to think about, and I want us to discuss next week, is where on the political spectrum that I discussed with you and you saw in your book, do you think most of our nation's political debate occurs? Do you think it's on the far right, the far left, in the middle, somewhere in between? Think about where you think most of the debate goes. And how can one's political ideology be understood in terms of economic issues and in terms of social issues or moral or personal issues? Okay? That's a question I want to throw out to you that I want you to think about. It is a review question, and we'll discuss that more in class. So on the political spectrum, you've got this traditional single axis, this one line, and let me replace some of the terms that I had used last night with some new ones that you can use interchangeably. So if you have left, another term that you can use instead of left is radical. Radical. Then on the right, if you want to use another term aside from right, you can go with reactionary. So a far left liberal, you could say, is a radical. A far right conservative could be a reactionary. And then in the middle, you have the moderate. A couple of issues just to kind of give you an idea of where liberal and conservative would fall on some matters. And as I keep on saying over and over again, this is a generalized idea of where they fall. But on the issue of abortion, liberals would generally be pro-choice. Conservatives would generally be pro-life. On capital punishment, a liberal would generally oppose capital punishment. A conservative would generally favor capital punishment. On the economy, a liberal would generally be in favor of regulation, and a conservative would generally be in favor of a hands-off approach, or what's called laissez-faire. In the topic of crime, a liberal would generally see the purpose of the government as to provide social services for rehabilitation. The conservative perspective would generally see the role of the government to provide structure with police and jails. In the topic of taxation, the government would generally say that, a liberal would generally say that the purpose of the government is to fund services, and a conservative would focus more on lowering taxes. So you have liberals saying more freedom of choice when it comes to social issues. Conservative would say more government control and establishment when it comes to social or moral issues. Now, if we take this axis where you have left, right, or liberal, conservative, if you have libertarian and communitarian, or let's say authoritarian or statist, you take this axis and then turn it 45 degrees so that you have a bit more of an X, and in the middle you have moderates. You have these categories. And you could fall somewhere in this general chart. And this scale is called a Nolan scale. And this is what I was wanting to start class off this morning with when I had you. And I was wanting you to do the world's smallest political quiz to see where you fall on this chart, whether you're a libertarian, you're conservative, you are a communitarian, a statist, or if you're a liberal, or possibly a moderate, or some combination. And a lot of times my students are on the line somewhere where they have 2 or maybe even 3 different ideologies conflicting. And that's pretty normal. Again, we are part of the narrow middle, where most Americans are somewhere in the middle of that range. So we'll do this on Monday. But if you look through the materials that I've given you, you'll see this Nolan chart. Okay, now the ideology and the scope of our government. We talked about just in general the chart between social issues, economic issues, where a libertarian, a communitarian, a statist, a liberal, and a conservative would fall. And so, just to make another general statement, let's just say libertarians would generally favor freedom in the three values of freedom, order, and equality. Libertarians would favor freedom the most, conservatives would favor order the most, liberals would favor equality the most. Now, there are different categories of theories. We have political theories, and so that would be libertarian, liberal, conservative, totalitarian, anarchy. There's also economic theories. And so with economic theories, if we're talking about less government control, we have laissez-faire. A little bit more government control, we have capitalism. And then extreme government control, you get into socialism and communism. The most popular two views, just to make sure that you're solid on this, in the United States would be conservative and liberal. And we have political parties that represent those ideologies that we'll discuss a little bit later. Now, speaking of the narrow middle in the United States, few Americans hold extreme ideologies. Most Americans are either liberal or conservative, and most describe themselves as moderate. All right. What I want you to do tonight, remember, is read your Locke reading. We'll discuss it tomorrow night in your flipped classroom. Feel free to flip through your wall, see if there's anything in here that you might have questions about. And make sure that you do the little pre-reading before reading one on John Locke on constitutional government. There's about a page and a half that you need to check out before you read. I'll tell you, on the AP exam, they love to pull questions from the readers. So make sure that you put that on your priority list to read the Locke reading. All right, guys, I hope that was a short little review on last night's content, and I will see you tomorrow. Have a great evening.